absolutely delighted to be able to listen to that speech, to be able to absorb some of what Reverend Sharpton had to say. And of course, in my observation, not only did we have a diverse crowd, not only was there differences in hue and differences in even political agendas, because there are some liberal perspectives and there are progressive perspectives that don't match. And we don't always agree. But what is instructive for all of us is the idea that this is one nation. And there are individuals in our country, the Limbaughs and the Becks and the Sean Hannitys, that revel in the idea of divisiveness. There are individuals like Hannity, like Laura Ingraham, a host of others, who feed on fear and prejudice. And what we got in terms of the run-up to the Glenn Beck rally and what we have today in our country is this fear and loathing that is being promulgated by the right wing. And it is the kind of politics that allows for a certain segment of our population to continue to harbor the racist feelings that's entrenched in their minds, that is deep within their hearts. That is what we're seeing all across the country today. And so what has become known as the Tea Party, what has become to be known as the fringe element, it is being fed by individuals who absolutely do not want to give up the racist, bigoted, prejudiced feelings that they have. They're holding on to what I often call selfish individualism and greed. In other words, what is good for me may not and perhaps isn't good for everybody, which would be a legitimate concern. But the problem is, I err on the side of the collective. That means I am my brother's keeper. That means that I put aside what is selfish. I put aside what is not only what is beneficial just for me, and I have a real and tangible interest in what happens to my community, my neighborhood, and this nation. What we've seen coming from the Becks of the world, they appeal to the base elements and the fringe of our society. And I want you to understand, there is a vast majority of white folks in this country who want to move beyond the issues of race, who want to move beyond the issues, or our constant harping on the divisions of race in this country. There are people who literally, it's one of the reasons why there was such a huge turnout in the 2008 election for Barack Obama. It was precisely because people understood the idea of extricating the hate from their hearts. There are so many people in this country that want to move beyond race, but there is that slither of the population who is desperately holding on to greed and selfish individualism. They're desperately holding on to their position as gatekeepers of the wealth divide in this country. That is what we are seeing. And so this weekend's rally suggests to me that not only are white folks and black folks and Hispanics and Chinese, the plethora of different colors and races across our country, not only are they willing to join hands and move beyond it, they're also interested in stamping out the bigotry that exists. Unfortunately, the Becks and the Limbaughs of the world, they continue to harbor these feelings, and they use these powerful mediums to inject a sort of bigotry that allow for further divisions in our country. And I dare say that this weekend's rally, for me and for a host of a host of other people. It suggests that we have a responsibility and an obligation to isolate those individuals who'd rather see a divided country than for all of us to join hands as a nation. It would be one thing if we can argue our points, our political perspectives in an amenable way, in an amiable way. The problem is when you hold on to racist and bigoted feelings, the result of that are the Obama signs looking as if he is a witch doctor. The constant railing against government, despite the fact that government is part of our lives. We are government. We are responsible for making our government work. It is okay to rail against your government when there is, when the government is bloated, when there's malfeasance, when there is bureaucracy. But when you taint your argument with bigotry, that is where the exception for me lies. And so I would suggest to you, as we continue to mull through the impact of this potential rally for the midterm elections, I will suggest to you that we give strong consideration to what we've seen, that there are people, particularly whites, who want to move beyond the issues of race. And the Becks, and the Limbaughs, and the Hannitys, and the Laura Ingrams, and the Michelle Malkins, and a host of others, they are holding on. And they have a slither of the population that is holding on to their prejudice and bigotry, and they are feeding that anger and frustration. And we have to reject that nonsense. We'll be back. One of the interesting things that we need to consider, I want to go back to Joe Miller because he is running for Senate out of Alaska. And he, in my judgment, is part of what we call the fringe element. The idea that you would eliminate Social Security, the minimum wage, there are a host of things that this individual, and he is representative of what we've seen across the country coming from the Tea Party. He represents a dangerous, and literally he's antithetical to our nation's well-being. Our government is responsible for protecting its citizens. And whenever you have an interest group like the Tea Party who will suggest to you that government is bad. Now again, I've often said, we have an opportunity to rail against our government. That's part of our freedoms. The problem is the government is part of our lives. And we as a nation depend on our government for a plethora of things. Our government is responsible for protecting its citizens against corporate greed, against corporate malfeasance, against the exploitation of workers. What do you mean you want to eliminate the minimum wage? So in other words, you don't want federal standards. Leave it up to the states, when what will ultimately happen is the state will, in terms of bargaining whether or not a particular company comes into the state, they're already at a deficit. Because most of our states, particularly now, are suffering so much economically that when a company does offer to come into that particular state, not only are they operating from a deficit, their bargaining power is significantly minimized. And so when you have a situation where a company will set standards in terms of a minimum wage, you take the power from the government to ensure its citizens that they have a livable wage. People are suffering out here today. And companies will be allowed to exploit their citizens, their workers. People who are already steeped in poverty would be literally relegated to wallowing in their misery if we allow for this kind of mentality to continue to exist the individuals like Joe Miller and Sharon Angle, who will suggest that they need to get rid of the minimum wage and allow for the state, who has significantly minimized bargaining power with a huge conglomerate coming into that state? No, it is the federal government who is tasked, I should say, with the responsibility of protecting its citizens. Imagine if a company comes into your state and they, because they have huge bargaining power and their tax write-offs would be so significant that they set a standard of $5 an hour for its employees. Who in the world could live off of $5 an hour? Our government is responsible for ensuring that its citizens have a livable wage. People who are existing off of $7 and $8 an hour. No, that's what our government is supposed to do. You cannot leave the states, who again will be operating from a deficit, to be able to bargain with states. There needs to be a standard. So ultimately, companies and CEOs, if we follow the Joe Miller line, will be allowed to, or be free to, make gross profits at the expense of the worker. And these folks are anti-union. One of the things that I've noticed being down here in the South is anti-union. And so these slave wages that people are making are as a result of the idea that we have no control over when individuals decide salary. There needs to be a standard here. And to allow someone like Joe Miller and others to suggest to any one of us that they can let the states set the standard without the power of the government to intervene in such matters, it is highly, highly irregular for me. It is not appropriate. That is what we pay our government to do. It is our responsibility. And so when I hear individuals like Joe Miller, I'm telling you, this individual is dangerous. And we have to give strong consideration to how we interact with individuals who will suggest that we get rid of the minimum wage, we get rid of Social Security. It is amazing to me how this mentality continues to persist. I'm telling you folks, you have to pay attention to what is going on in this country. You have to give strong consideration to the argument, and we have to argue our points, but at the same time there needs to be a reasoned argument here. And we cannot allow individuals who will act as if someone living off of $5 an hour, that it is okay. It is not okay. That nonsense needs to stop.